take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carol. What a joy to be here to discuss one of my favorite topics with everybody. I love all things fruit, small fruit, tree fruit, you name it. Today, though, I'm going to try to stay focused and talk about two of my favorites for home landscapes, particularly for folks who are short on space. So really good for urban growing environments. So what we'll do is I'll start out with just some general information, site selection, things like that, and then we'll focus on blackberry and blueberry fruit culture for home landscapes. So to get started,
Ashley, I apologize. I must have muted you.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I'm not sure what folks heard, so I'm just gonna start over. So why would you be interested in growing small fruits? Your reasons might be different, but just some of the main reasons is, of course, fruits taste delicious. They're very healthy for you, particularly blackberries and blueberries with their anthocyanin contents. Recently, there's been a new movement where we call it edible landscaping, where folks are trying to work in some of these healthy plants into their home landscapes for the aesthetic value, but also just for that nutritional content as well. Some of my personal favorite reasons for trying to grow blackberries and blueberries in particular is that these are both native fruits to our region of the country, and so they're going to have that natural resilience towards some of our pest and disease pressures, which is an added bonus, as opposed to some of our non-native crops like apple and peach, which while they're delicious, we have a more heightened pest and disease pressure that makes those more challenging to grow. So in general, blackberry and blueberry are going to be more low maintenance in comparison to some of our other more high maintenance fruit crops. And then additionally, a major bonus for growing small fruits is they tend to be very prolific. You get a lot of fruit on a small plant. And so those are just some of the, I think, some main incentives for wanting to work some of these into your home landscape. So unfortunately, if it were as easy as just putting the plant in the ground, we'd all have blackberries and blueberries growing in our houses, but that's just not really the case. You know, there are some things we can control, but a lot of things we can't. So the weather, for example, last week we had a severe freeze in North Georgia, made it very difficult for folks who had some fruit trees flowering during that time. We had some damage. And so sometimes you just can't control impacts that are going to limit production like weather, but things like soil fertility, pH, site selection, those are things we can control. And so I want to spend just a minute talking about site selection, because out of all the places I've been and fruits I've looked at that are in trouble, it's almost always due to poor site selection, which is something we can definitely address on the front end and hopefully prevent you from having a failing planting just due to location. So some of the main considerations when we're selecting a site for fruit, because this isn't like vegetables where you can try again next year with new plants. You know, you're in a long-term relationship with these small fruits you're putting in. So we want to set them off on the best possible start we can. And that starts by selecting the proper site. And so what I mean by that is, of course, you know, plants get their energy by converting sunlight into chemical energy inside of the plant. And so obviously we want to harvest as much sunlight as possible so we can create the photosynthetics we need to push a crop, because creating fruit is a very energy expensive thing for a plant to do. So we want to make sure we have 8 to 10 hours of sun ideally, so those plants can set a full crop. Additionally, other than just not having enough sun, I've noticed that especially in urban areas, this can be an issue, soil compaction. So if our soils aren't draining well, these plants are going to get root rot. The new root initials aren't going to be able to push out through the soil profile and establish well. I'm sure everybody who's had a plant die in their landscape, if you pull that plant up and look at its roots, a lot of them will just be girdling around basically following that shape that they were growing in the container if you're planting into heavy clay soils and you didn't work that soil properly, because those roots just cannot push through that compacted clay. And then another thing that's more of an issue up here in my neck of the woods in North Georgia, but in the Piedmont regions, there are still some hilly areas, is just making sure that, you know, if your yard looks like the picture here, you're very mindful of where the frost pockets are and where the poor drainage is. So this pretty much looks like my backyard. And so if you're short on sunlight areas, you know, you might be tempted to plant right here in this recessed area because there's no trees. You know, you can get down there, there's sunlight, but boy, is this the wrong choice, because you can see cold air is heavier than warm air, so it's going to be closest to the Earth's crust, and it's going to roll down this hill and pool in this recessed pocket, which we call a frost pocket. So it's going to be much, much colder down here as it's going to be on the side of the slope, for example. But we also have other pitfalls. You know, you might be tempted to plant right here in this open space, because while I'm not down here in the bottom, you know, I'm up here on the hill. This dense wood line is still thick enough to capture cold air here. So this is another frost pocket. So these would be danger zones for siting your planting. So ideally, you would want something a little bit more like this. So a cleared slope, ideally, so that cold air can move freely down the slope. We certainly wouldn't want to plant here again, but just keeping in mind not planting between dense stands of trees, even if it is on a hillside, and certainly don't plant in that lowest area, because that's where all the cold air is going. So there's a little bit more to it than just finding a place with sunshine. Yes, we want light, but we definitely don't want to be planting in a frost pocket that's going to hurt us in spring, with last week being a grand example of that. So be very mindful, a careful shopper when you're looking for a site. Once you find one, and this is just a picture of a research plot I put in. So your planting might not be as big as this, but I think it's a good example of just preparing your site in advance from planting. You know, a lot of folks will buy their plants that week, and then that same weekend go and flop them in the ground without doing a soil test or doing proper site preparations to make sure that these plants get the start they need to succeed. And so some things that you can do, you know, I'm a big advocate for trying to prepare your site several months in advance, just because if our soil test, for example, indicates we need to raise our pH, it takes about 6 months for lime to truly activate, to create that chemical reaction where we're going to raise our pH up by a unit. So, you know, it behooves you to plan ahead. Like, for example, if you decide that you want to try to plant blackberries and blueberries, I would argue, well, go ahead and start preparing your site now for a fall planting. But some of the things that you would want to do to prepare your site would be to, of course, remove all competing weeds or grass, take that soil sample so you can know if you need to add lime and other starter nutrients, and work that soil well so we can address any compaction issues. If you don't have the space for an in-ground planting, or you've decided that your soil is just severely compacted fill dirt, for example, and you just don't think much of anything can probably live in it, don't worry. Both of these crops, blackberry and blueberry, do well in raised beds. So constructing something like you see here, this is a backyard blackberry planting on a T-post trellis system. So for this, you know, I would recommend minimum of 2 feet wide. I prefer 3 feet wide, and you can make it as long as you want. So this is certainly an option, and you can bypass some of that frustrating site preparation work if you don't want to put your plants in the ground. Speaking on how to plant just for a moment, so you can plant any time of the year. But I'm sure everyone's probably heard, you know, plant in the fall or winter, and there's a reason for that, and that those plants are dormant, so the above ground portion is not actively growing, but roots still do grow in the winter months. And so you can avoid transplanting stress, because it's pretty hot in the summer. It's stressful for a plant, you know, especially if it's not established in its site. You can, if you do a fall or a winter planting, those roots can grow and establish, and that plant will have an easier first summer once those roots are truly established in the ground. So that's why we advocate for that. But, you know, you can plant in the spring or summer, so long as you're making sure that that plant gets the water it needs to continue to grow and not undergo any type of drought or heat stress. As far as container plants go, generally we'll want to plant those at the same depth they were growing in their containers, but check and see. You know, sometimes they get potted up a little too deep, so just find the crown of that plant and make sure that, you know, it's not 2 or 3 inches underneath some soil there. Use your best judgment. But, you know, if there's any girdling or it looks like that plant has been root bound, break that up a little bit, and then you can plant your plant ideally in a hole that's at least two times as wide as the container it was growing in. And then if you're planting bare root plants, the same rule applies. We're going to want to dig a hole large enough for those roots to spread out with some excess, and then just cover up those roots and water in thoroughly, and it should be just fine. So let's go ahead and switch gears to talk about blackberries, because they have a pretty unique life cycle and it can be confusing for folks. So I do want to spend some time on that so everyone understands how do blackberries grow and how can we manipulate that growth and development in our favor. And so blackberries are what we call a biennial perennial plant. I'm sure everyone knows what perennial means. So it will come back year after year, but it's also biennial, meaning that it will take 2 growing seasons for this plant to fruit. And what makes it even more complicated is that these plants have that vegetative growth and reproductive growth coexisting in the same season. So it can be confusing knowing, okay, which part of this plant is going to give me fruit and which part is vegetative. And so the way that we can identify that is by calling our vegetative growth Primocanes and our reproductive growth Floricanes. So you can see my little fruits I put on the tree there, or that plant there on the right. So that's a Floricane. But speaking about the vegetative growth, just a little bit more to complicate things. So blackberries have a fairly deep root system, but it can put out some shallow, more stoloniferous type roots that you can see here in the picture that are going to put up suckers. But these vegetative canes, you know, they're kind of floppy. They're not as rigid as a blueberry plant. And so sometimes these primocanes will bend over, and then you can end up with a little daughter plant a little further away. So these things can get kind of wild if you're not really paying attention and pruning them properly. You can end up with a jungle if you're not careful. So just wanted you to be aware that these things can shoot up suckers, and canes can lay down, and before you know it, you've got a lot going on. So shifting back to the reproductive growth. So what we have here is, you know, a primocane will grow. Let's just use this summer as an example. This plant's going to put up vegetative growth called primocanes. Fall will come, they'll shed their leaves, and then next year, that primocane is going to be a second-year cane, a floricane, and it's going to produce fruit. After it produces fruit, that floricane is going to die. And then you will want to remove that dead floricane, train up some nice strong primocanes, and knowing that those will be what produces your fruit the next season. So that's how the blackberry life cycle works. We'll want to leave those primocanes like you can see there again, because that's next year's crop. So if that wasn't confusing enough for you, I'm going to try to show you what this actually looks like on real plants. So again, primocane, they're the new vegetative growth that emerges in a current season. And then the floricane is what the primocane becomes the next year. So that's a 2-year-old cane. So Primocane, you can see it here. It's very bright, tender vegetative growth. You can see how vigorous it is in that top right picture there, shooting straight up from that mulch band. And you can see them in the left picture as well. Those are some new Primocanes that are being trained up for next year's crop. And then some Floricanes you can see in the top right picture. You can even see some of the flowers on those. So that's second year growth. And you can also see how those Primocanes like to pop up on the same season. So being able to tell the difference is really important in maintaining your planting. And then that bottom picture, I've circled a Floricane leaf. Another way you can kind of tell the difference between these two different growth stages is that the Primocanes tend to be very bright lime green. They also tend to have about 3 leaflets, whereas the Floricanes, bottom picture here with the circle, Floricanes tend to have only 3 leaflets per leaf, and they tend to be a little bit darker and thicker. So you can kind of see the difference between those leaves in that bottom picture. So once you've seen them a few times, you can pretty easily tell the difference, but that is a nice little trick to help you differentiating between what you've got going on, especially before they start flowering. So moving on, we do classify blackberries by different types. So one's going to be the growth habit. So how do the canes grow? Are they trailing like a dewberry that you see wild growing on the side of the road? Are they semi-trailing, meaning they're kind of upright, but they're still fairly droopy? And then erect, whereas they're going to be a little bit more rigid and grow straight up and don't need quite as much support as our other types. Through an active breeding program, we've also made it to where some blackberries will have thorns, but some of our newer varieties are thornless. So that's a pretty big plus. And then we also, over recent years, through more targeted breeding approaches, we now have Floricane fruiting varieties and Primocane fruiting varieties. So there is a lot going on in the blackberry world, and it kind of makes you wonder, well, how do I even know what to buy? So we'll get into varieties in just a minute, but just so you can kind of further understand these different types, you can see the growth habits delineated up here on the top of the slide. We've got that trailing one on the right. Again, think wild dewberries growing on the side of the road, semi-erect, and then that erect type on the far left. So we primarily grow erect or semi-erect varieties in our region. The trailing types really are more of what's grown in Oregon and Washington State. But having said all of that, even though erect types do tend to be more rigid and they don't require as much support, I think that all blackberries really do benefit from trellising, and it will make your life a lot easier when working with these plants if they're contained on a trellis structure. So here's just some pictures of some trellising structures that you might be interested in making. These plans are very easily found with extension publications. UGA Extension has a blackberry publication you can look at, but this just gives you an idea of what type of trellis would be good for a blackberry planting. So, you know, after you get your plants in the ground, of course, you would want to encourage the growth between these wires so they're contained and not flopping all over your yard, making it difficult for you to manage them. After you've made it through your first year, these plants are going to be much more vigorous. The root system is going to be established, and you're going to be able to work with them a little bit better. They're going to grow more vigorously, and so you're probably going to need to do a little pruning, because we don't want 10-foot tall canes. You know, we really want them topped around 3 to 4 feet to encourage lateral branching. And so when you're training these things up, you know, it's when they're young and tender, you can honestly just pinch that growing tip off. We call it soft tipping, to remove that terminal bud and induce lateral branching. Later in the season, once these canes get a little girth to them, you'll want to use your snips or loppers, and we call that hardtop tipping. And you can see, here's a close-up for you, what that looks like. So that small diameter growth on the left, it's nice when we can tip at that stage, because it's opening up a much smaller wound as opposed to that picture on the right. So it helps with managing disease issues, things like that. But both are completely fine pruning techniques. And it's essential to keep the growth in check and make sure that you have plants the proper size that are going to fruit for you and do well in the landscape. So again, this is just a close-up for you of what that hard tipping would look like when we remove that apical bud, once we have growth above that top trellis wire there. And then you can see what happens when you remove that apical growing tip. We get that lateral branching, and that's where our fruit's coming from. So we really definitely want to top our canes so we can get that lateral growth and get the fruit that we want. And this is kind of what it looks like, y'all. So these are blackberries growing through between some trellis wires. And you can see that once you've tipped these canes, you're going to get that lateral growth that you want. They're going to be nice and stocky and able to support a heavy fruit crop that year. So that's what you want. After your Primocanes become Floricanes the next year, they're going to fruit for you, and then they're going to die. And you're going to have to remove these dead Floricanes and thin out any weak Primocanes while you're at it. Because again, like once these Floricanes die, you don't want them to stick around. You need to get them out of the way, and you need to start training up your Primocane so you can have next year's infrastructure in place for fruit. So fast forward, our Floricanes have died. We have trained up some nice Primocanes in our trellis, and they're pretty wild looking. So now it's time to do a little winter pruning to reel them back in, because we don't want excessive growth. So some things that you can do is, depending on the variety, keep 4 to 8 healthy Primocanes. You can see they all grow in like the central crown here. So it's not a continuous hedge going down the row. You can see where each plant is. So we'll remove any extra canes or those that don't look very strong, or they're growing in the middle, for example, because you want to keep these things organized. And then you'll cut your laterals back, if they're excessively long, to about 1 foot or so, so they can support your fruit for next summer. So again, just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here, when I meant there are Floricane fruiting varieties and Primocane fruiting varieties. It's pretty wild. Historically, we've only ever had Floricane fruiting varieties. So again, that's fruits that develop on 2-year-old canes. Primocane fruiting varieties are now on the market. You'll probably see them if you're looking on nursery websites. I want you to know what it is, because they are very different in the way that you're going to manage these plants. So again, a Primocane fruiting variety means that vegetative growth is capable of putting on fruit. And so generally, you will get 2 crops in 1 year, which is, sounds good. But unfortunately, Primocane fruiting varieties, they will be setting their second crop when it's pretty much the hottest time of year for us down here in the deep South. And so while these things have the potential to fruit twice for you, I would discourage folks as far south as folks in the metro Atlanta area trying to grow them, just because the heat is so extreme that they don't tend to, that second crop doesn't tend to do as well as it would further north, like where I am in Blue Ridge. So you might have some disappointing yields. We have lots of really good Floricane fruiting varieties that would be probably best for a planting in the metro Atlanta area. And so I just wanted y'all to be aware of the many, many, many different types and varieties of blackberries out there, because it can be confusing and, you know, exciting to think, oh, I can get 2 crops of blackberries in one season. I'm going to get these Primocane fruiting varieties. But the summer heat can be an issue. So I just want y'all to be aware of that. Not that you can't try it, but it might be frustrating. So I would definitely recommend you look at some of those thornless Floricane fruiting types, and just some of my favorites. You know, Natchez has been around on the market for forever. Great thornless variety. Osage is another one. And then more recently, over the past few years, some new additions from the Arkansas State Breeding Program have been released. Sweetheart Caddo and Sweetheart Ponca are both new varieties. They're great and they're suitable for home planting. So definitely consider giving those a try. Just a little bit about pollination, because it can be confusing. Do I need multiple plants? Do I need different varieties? How can I make sure I get a good crop? Fortunately for you, if you're interested in blackberries, they are self-fruitful. So we only need one variety to get fruit. However, you know, don't underestimate the power of insect pollination. Our native bees and honeybees and butterflies getting out there pollinating your plants will certainly enhance fruit sets. So be aware that we want to make sure we're kind to our bees and providing a good, healthy backyard habitat to where they can do their thing. So when am I going to get fruit? Generally, the very end of May through early July is when your area of the state will be harvesting blackberries. They're very prolific. Once they've been established for 3 or 4 years, you can get anywhere from 10 to 20 pounds of fruit per plant. So 4 to 6 plants can easily sustain a family of 4 to 5. Obviously, we're going to want to harvest these when fully ripe, and that's something that you can really benefit from in a home planting as opposed to buying in the store, because there are technically 2 ripeness stages for blackberry. We have the shiny black stage. I know that's a creative name there, and you can see it's pictured in this picture in the front left. And the best way I can describe it is that the drupelets are a little bit tighter. They're not quite as soft, and it's a brighter, shinier looking black. That is a completely fine ripeness stage, but you're definitely going to have a tartar berry. And that's pretty much the ripeness stage that you'll be eating berries from the grocery store, just because these are a pretty delicate, perishable crop, and they just don't last very long if you harvest them at their peak ripeness stage, which is what we call the dull black stage. And it's pictured in the back. You can see that back right berry. It's a little bit duller black, not quite as shiny. Those drupelets are just swollen and full to the brim with juice, and it's going to be at its sweetest ripeness stage. So folks who are growing backyard berries can take full advantage of harvesting at that peak ripeness and get the sweetest berry possible. So when we're harvesting, we definitely want to pick in the early morning hours or in the evening, because during the day, these fruits are absorbing a ton of heat. We call it field heat, and that can really deteriorate berry quality once it's been picked if they're still hot. So I recommend picking in the early morning or the evening for peak storage and quality. And if you have a ton of berries and you don't think you can eat them all in time, pick them all. You can lay them out on a cookie sheet unwashed. Do not pre-wash your berries. Lay them out on a cookie sheet, separated so they're not overlapping with one another. Throw them in the freezer. Take them off the cookie sheet, label a freezer bag, and they'll keep for several weeks just fine. So no reason to let your bounty go to waste. But that is my talk on blackberries. And now we're going to change gears and talk about blueberries. So blueberries are interesting in that they are one of the only fruits that I'm aware of that is naturally blue, which I find it really neat. And the reason for that blue color is that they have a nice white bloom on the exterior that creates that nice foggy frosty blue color. So Obviously, blueberries are renowned for their health benefits, and they are a beautiful landscaping plant as well. So if you're not sure you want to deal with wrangling blackberries, blueberries are certainly worth a try. They aren't fussy plants, and boy, do you get the aesthetic quality with that nice red fall color, beautiful white blooms, one of the earliest flowering shrubs that can provide a nectar resource for our pollinators if you're into that type of thing. And then on top of that, not only are you getting a pretty plant in the landscape, you're helping pollinators out, but you get great delicious fruit in early summer. So I think blueberries are definitely a win-win-win for a home gardener. Out of all the different varieties available, I do think rabbit eye types are going to be the best choice for a home garden. This is a native species to Georgia and the Southeast in general. They've been around for a really long time, and they're just tough plants. And so there's some other varieties out there that you can look at that I would think that it's going to be a slam dunk if you get a rabbit eye, because they're just a really good resilient variety and totally appropriate for the Piedmont region. There are lots of varieties available. These are not the only ones on the market, but they are ones that I recommend because I know they do well in central Georgia. And so one of the things you can do, because blueberries are not like blackberries, they are not self-fruitful. So to maximize your yields, you are going to want to pick at least 2 different varieties with overlapping bloom time. So for example, if I want 2 early varieties, I'm going to plant Vernon and Titan because I know that these 2 both are early season varieties. They're going to be flowering at the same time, and therefore they can cross-pollinate one another for maximum yield and fruiting potential. Furthermore, if you really love blueberries and you want to stretch your season out as long as possible, you can plant some early, some mid-season, and some late-season varieties. And so we've clumped those varieties together on this slide so you can see which ones you would want to pick depending on the time of the season that you'd want berries. Now, I mentioned there were other types, so I did just want to mention there are some northern high bush varieties on the market, and you'll probably see these when you're looking at nursery catalogs and things like that. So I want you to be aware of these other types, although I still think rabbit eye is the best choice for most home gardeners. Up here in North Georgia, we do have some level of northern high bush production. But this is really a type that's grown much, much, much further north than us. So Michigan and New Jersey are growing these. So you can see the difference in growing conditions there, and that's why it's called northern high bush. They are generally considered self-fruitful, but they definitely benefit from cross-pollination as well from another variety. And so if anyone's just really wanting to try these, you might want to try Jersey, Blue Crop, or Early Blue. But again, I would stick to rabbit eye if you can. Southern high bush are the other variety that I see folks try to plant even as far as north as North Georgia, which they're just not going to do well. These guys have a very low chill hour requirement, 300 to 600 hours. This winter we got about 14 or 15 hours of chill in North Georgia. So these things would have flowered way too early, and we would have lost all of our blooms due to early frost. So that's why we don't want to grow varieties that are out of our USDA hardiness zones. So you'll see these on the market too, and maybe even at nurseries. Just be a careful shopper. And you can even see by the names of some of these cultivars, Gulf Coast, for example. Well, I wonder where we would want to plant that. And you can see in this picture here with these southern high bushes, that's sand. So these are truly suitable for the coastal plains. You folks in the Piedmont region are just a little too far north to grow southern high bush without extraordinary freeze protection attempts. So again, just stick with rabbit eye. They're wonderful berries, and there are lots of different choices that you can pick from. But I do want to switch gears and just talk a little bit about soil preparation for blueberry, because they are not the same as blackberries, which will be happy with a pH of about 6.5 or 6. Blueberries are in the Vaccinium genus. They are similar to our rhododendrons and azaleas and mountain laurel that are all acid-loving plants. Blueberry really cannot tolerate a pH of higher than 5.5. I really like to see the pH around 4.5 to 5. So if you do your soil test and you see that your pH is at 5.5 or higher, that's not an ideal site for blueberry, and we will probably look at putting some wettable sulfur to drive that pH lower. Furthermore, just going ahead and throwing it out there to folks, if you're looking at doing container gardening for blueberries, or you're wanting to do raised beds, be very cautious about the material you buy, because the Miracle-Gro potting soil and pretty much all of our container or potting soils that are available are going to be amended with lime for vegetable production or flowers that want that higher pH. So the blueberries will be very, very unhappy in that type of potting media. So be aware of that. If your site does have a high pH, there is something we can do about it. I mentioned sulfur. So definitely work with your county agent if you're wanting to lower your pH, because you can definitely do too much and really, really cause yourself some problems. So just be aware of that, and don't hesitate to reach out for help if you're looking at wanting to use sulfur to lower your pH for a blueberry planting. Something else about blueberries I do want to mention is that, I mentioned earlier, we want full sun, and that's something I try not to compromise on. However, your plant's not going to die if it's in about 50% shade, although that's the maximum that I would be willing to try. Just understand that, if that's the best site you have, just expect some depressed yields. The plant will survive. It's just not going to be able to set as much fruit as it could were it to have optimum sun exposure. Something we cannot compromise on is going to be soil drainage. So if you dig a hole, for example, and you leave it because you're going to get a big rain and you want to see how easily water drains through that hole, if you still have water in it 24 hours after it's rained, that is not a good site. That doesn't have adequate drainage. So that's a good way to learn, what your drainage potential is in that potential site. Of course, again, we want a nice big wide hole, and blueberries do benefit from some organic matter. So if you want to amend your site, let's say you've got a lot of clay, no organic matter in sight, you can add about 2 or so gallons of peat moss or aged milled pine bark, thoroughly worked throughout the entire planting soil. So mix that very, very well with the native soil, and that should help that blueberry get established. Blueberries also require frequent light irrigation. Again, we don't want a soggy mess. We don't want to rot those roots, but we do want to make sure that these plants get the water they need to establish. They do great in raised beds, and they also benefit from having a nice mulch layer. So, for example, this is just a planting I did. It was 4 or 5 foot spacing, rabbit eyes. And you can see the drip tape over there. It's okay if you don't have that type of irrigation. The mulch really does help lock in moisture, but just be aware of the different opportunities that are out there for you. Those soaker hoses, for example, work really well in helping not overwater, but maintaining a nice, moist growing environment. And just a little bit more about fertilization, because blueberries are not like most fruit crops. They have different needs. And so being mindful of what fertilizer do I use. So triple 10, for example, while you can use it, it's readily available at pretty much any garden center or big box store. It's not the best formula for blueberry. I would rather see something with the ammonium form of nitrogen in it, like a 12-6-4 analysis, or even like a camellia or an azalea fertilizer, which are designed for acid-loving plants, would be better. Keep in mind that we don't want to over-fertilize blueberries. I would much rather you under-fertilize than over-fertilize, because they're very salt-sensitive plants. They're not going to want a lot of fertilizer at once. So doing small, more frequent fertilizing applications would be better than one really big dose. And again, don't be afraid to look at that label. Stay away from fertilizers that have the nitrate form of nitrogen. Blueberries are intolerant to that form of nitrogen. They much prefer ammonium forms of nitrogen. And so again, ammonium sulfate is a good option. And again, if this is too much for you, just go to the shop and pick something that's for camellias or azaleas, and it's probably going to be just fine for blueberries. Just so you can see what's going to happen if you don't do your soil test and your pH is too high. And again, I would say anything at the 5.5 mark is getting to be too high. Blueberry, this is what we call blueberry chlorosis. The new growth is turning yellow. You can see it's that interveinal chlorosis. So the vein is green, but it's yellow in between those veins. This is due to an iron deficiency because that nutrient is not available at higher pH levels, and you start to see this yellowing in your new growth. So this is a cry for help from this plant that the pH is too high, it can't uptake nitrogen, and you're going to need to address that. So if I saw this, I would definitely use an ammonium sulfate fertilizer to try to help bring that soil pH down slowly over time. But you might want to do that soil test just to see how far off you are, because you might want to add a little sulfur to try to drive that pH down lower. So care and maintenance. The first year, there's really not that much to do. We definitely don't want to allow that plant to flower or fruit, because again, that's a very energy expensive transaction for a plant to make. And that first year, we want to focus entirely on getting that plant established by growing roots and putting on some more vegetative growth. We also want to make sure we remove any weed competition. You wouldn't believe how detrimental allowing grass to grow around the base of that plant is, because the grass has a more shallow root system. It's going to get all the water first, all the fertilizer first, and the blueberry is just going to get the scraps. So they will definitely be competing with each other. So it would behoove you to remove, I would argue, a 2.5, 3 foot by 3 foot area around the base of that plant to keep weed and grass competition from hindering the growth and development of that new planting. And again, pine bark or pine straw mulch is great. You know, again, both of these are going to have an acidic composition to them. And so as they slowly degrade over time, it's further building a nice, rich, organic rooting zone, but also it's maintaining that low pH. So that is a great mulch to use for blueberries, and it's relatively affordable as well, which is nice, and it lasts for several years. So other than that, after you plant those blueberries, don't be afraid to give them a little bit of a haircut. They're probably going to have some scraggly growth that's really not going to do much for the plant. You're better off going ahead and pruning them back anywhere from half to 1/3 their height to remove some of that lower twiggy growth that's not going to be very productive to the development and structure of that plant. Moving on, plants have been in ground for a year or two. We really don't want to do too much pruning to them. We want to allow them to grow and send up new canes. So really, it's only once they reach 4 to 5 feet that we're going to want to start doing height removal on these plants. We really only need to prune them once they get a little bit older. The canes start crowding out each other. We don't want a very, very, very dense canopy because we do want airflow. So you can see here the picture on the left, canes are starting to grow together a little bit in the center of that plant, preventing good air circulation. So you can see where some of those canes were removed to open up that center of the canopy and have a nice spreading look that is what you're going for there. And again, if height reduction becomes an issue, you can certainly head canes back. So that's not an issue. It's not going to hurt the plant. But we don't want to get too overzealous with this pruning because we need to know where our fruit is developed. And the fruit is going to be developed on these nice cinnamon colored canes here. They fruit on the previous year's growth. So as your plant gets older, you might want to have to start removing older canes in favor of these younger, more productive canes. Again, you can see the younger ones are that bright cinnamon colored. You know, it's not that you want to remove all old growth, but you definitely want to maintain maybe 8 to 10 canes per plant over time. You know, we've fast forwarded here. These are mature plants, but I want you to know what it's going to look like as this tree or as this plant ages, so you can know what ratio of canes you'll want depending on life stage. So lots of more detailed information is available in our home blueberry production guide, but sometimes just seeing pictures and hearing someone talk it out can be very helpful for folks. So wanted y'all to see what a more mature plant will look like so you can know what you might want to remove later down the road. As far as pest control goes, there really aren't that many pests or diseases that are going to bother blueberry. Birds are definitely going to want to eat your crops. You know, there are some insects out there that are going to take advantage, but it's really, I would argue, birds and weeds, maybe even mice or voles getting in your mulch band might be a problem, but they're fairly low maintenance, and it's something that you can keep an eye on. Sometimes you might get some foliar diseases, things like that, if it's been a really wet year, but that's something that you can work on and deal with some easy fungicide sprays if necessary. Again, blueberries are insect pollinated, and we need multiple varieties to improve fruit set, so don't forget that. And as far as the harvesting window, I love blueberry and blackberry because they really complement each other well. You'll start the season out harvesting blackberries, and right as you're done with that, June through August, blueberries will start coming in, and so you can really enjoy fruit throughout the whole summer months. And unlike blackberry, blueberry can be left on the plant for much longer. You're going to be picking blackberries at peak ripeness every other day. Blueberries, you can probably wait every 5 to 7 days if you're not having competition with birds or neighbors that may want to eat your fruit. So they can hang a lot longer. And again, just going back to the bloom, because I don't know if I really talked about the bloom that makes a blueberry blue. If you were to wipe off that foggy blue coating, you really have a black berry underneath, but it's that white bloom that makes the blueberry blue, and it's a protective layer on that berry, and so it helps prevent it from drying out and for post-harvest diseases to set in. Like, I'm sure folks have probably left some berries in the refrigerator too long, and you get that gray mold or botrytis growing on them. So the bloom really helps protect the berry, and it makes it last in the refrigerator a lot longer. So don't rub that off. And there's no reason to wash your berries in advance. It's going to greatly reduce their shelf life if you do that. So I'm a big advocate of go ahead and pick what you need. If you've got an excess, do the cookie sheet freezer trick I mentioned with the blackberries and put them away, and just wash your berries as you're using them before you eat them, and that should be completely safe and fine to do. So just talking a little bit about what to expect. You know, under good care, you've done your homework, you've prepared your site correctly. You should be getting a small crop on year 2, and by year 3, you should be able to get a fairly respectable amount of berries to nibble on, and make sure that when you're harvesting these guys, again, just like with the blackberry, harvest in the morning or the evening. It's best not to pick during the day when they have all that internal field heat that's going to decrease quality and once you've reached year 5 or 6, you could easily be picking a few gallons off each plant. So you'll get a lot of fruit off of them. But anyways, that's going to conclude my presentation. Hopefully we have a few questions that we can clear up. I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ashley. That was really informative. Loved it. We do actually have a couple of questions. So the first one that I've got here is about blackberries and if they might do well in a container. So she asked about a 25 to 30 inch pot. Would that be big enough to respectably grow a blackberry plant, or would it thrive in such a condition?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So I worked at a nursery in my undergraduate days, and we did maintain some of our stock mother plants for propagation in large. They might have been 15 or 20 gallon containers. So you definitely want to go on the bigger side as opposed to a smaller side, because obviously we're going to want to allow those plants to really develop a nice, robust root system and have enough space to grow. And also, we don't want that container to dry out, because I'm sure everyone has experienced during summer, boy, do I have to water my container plants like twice a day, or they're just going to wither up and die. So that's another reason for having that bigger container, just because it's going to hold more soil and it's going to stay a little bit wetter longer. But yeah, you can do it. You can give it a try. They're probably going to be a little wild. You'll want to try to do some type of support structure. Like if you want to try maybe 3 15-gallon containers for 3 different plants, and maybe erect some type of trellising system on the sides to hold those canes up, that will probably work just fine. Just be mindful that you're going to have to water them more frequently than you would in in-ground planting. And probably limit the number of canes, just to make it to where it's not too busy in there. But I think it's doable.
So while we're on the topic of blackberry, I actually had a question as well. So I've always heard, and this may be an old wives' tale, so I'm not 100%, but that the thorn versus the thornless and the wild versus the cultivated for flavor. I've always heard that wild berries have the best flavor, and that the thornless don't have as good of a flavor as the ones with thorns. So I don't know if that's true, or if what you think about that.
Yeah, so that's fun. So, and that really comes down to personal preference, right? Because I'm one of those people that like a nice tart blackberry, whereas other folks want it as sweet as they can get it. So that's really going to come down to cultivar. And there are lots of cultivars on the market. Now, I can't really speak to which cultivar is the best, because again, all of our taste buds are different and we're going to have those preferences. I've definitely met people who only want to eat wild blackberries or the wild dewberries. I mean, I certainly picked my fair share growing up along the side of our dirt road. We had those, and we picked. It was a fight between me and the dogs on who could eat more. So, I mean, there's definitely value to foraging for our wild berries for sure. But there's also more modern varieties that are just absolutely fantastic. Arkansas State University is the flagship for the breeding program of blackberries. I highly recommend, if you're curious and learning more about some of those newer varieties, but also the older ones, to go to their website, look at their blackberry breeding program. And Dr. John Clark, who is the breeder over there, has videos where he talks about each one, and there's a really nice write-up about them, so you can learn more. And if you're one of those folks that really wants a big sweet berry, you know, those are out there. And then you can also kind of look at some of the older varieties, but each one will be different. You're right about that, but I don't know if I can speak to thornless versus thorny and which one's better. They're just all a little bit different. If I answered your question at all or made it more complicated.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was just curious what you thought about that. And then finally, we had one final question about blueberries. So Dora says that they're always eaten by birds before she can get to them. And what recommendations do you have for preventing birds?
Man, boy, is that a toughie. And there's really not a good, I really don't know of a good way. I mean, back when I was in the private sector trying to grow them, the Canadian Canadian geese were my worst enemy because it was a farm on a lake, and boy, oh boy, did we have a goose problem, and they would eat your lunch in a hurry. And so we tried everything from those, I don't even know what you call them, those, I guess they're wind powered, like little characters that'll flap, like you see them at car dealerships and things like that. We tried that. I don't know how much your neighbors would like that option. I've tried reflective flagging. It kind of looks holographic, and you can tie it on the shoot, like the outer shoots of your plants, and they'll flap in the wind and they'll sparkle and kind of freak the birds out a little bit. I've had success with that. Now, don't put it out too early. I would put it right before the berries start looking desirable, because they will get used to it. But I've had good luck with that. I'm not a fan of bird netting because I've just seen a lot of non-target animals die, and then also the birds as well will get caught in it and die a pretty horrible death. So I'm not a fan of netting just because I've seen the dark side of it. But unfortunately, it's just a battle with nature. The old timers always told me, "Well, just plant enough for you and the birds," and it just never feels like enough, you know. But try the reflective flagging. That's worked for me on a large scale before. But just don't put it out too early, because they're smart enough to learn, and they'll eventually learn that that's not a threat. But give it a shot this year and see how you do.
Very cool. And one final question did come in about propagating. Let's see, let me scroll back up here. Can blueberries be propagated from a stem cutting?
So they can be a little fussy with cuttings. You're probably better off. I mean, you can definitely try. You'll want to try to keep the moisture level high. And you can try a rooting hormone if you want. Of course, don't do that for patented varieties, please. But for some of those that have been long off patent, like a Premier, Climax, you can try to do cuttings, but I would probably say you'll have better luck just pulling up a daughter plant that shoots off the root system and pops up. They're very similar to blackberries in that they have that nice stoloniferous root system that's going to stretch out. Instead of just cutting that daughter plant off at the soil line when it's popping up in an undesirable area, just cut that root and pot it up, and you've got a new plant. It's a lot easier than trying to keep cuttings alive. Although if it's something that you just have a personal interest in, you can certainly give it a shot. Just know that you're going to want to probably use a rooting hormone, keep them moist and humid so those cuttings don't desiccate before they have a chance to root.
Ashley, thank you so much. That's the end of all the questions that I have for today, but I really appreciate you talking to us today about small fruits. And if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to send them to me. I'll type my email in the chat box and I can follow up with you. But otherwise, that's all I had for today. And thank you again. Thanks everybody for joining and for paying attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, bye everybody. Thanks for joining again. And thanks again, Ashley.